In chess, positional principles and concepts are crucial for evaluating positions, making plans and implementing these plans. However, sticking to these principles too strictly can turn a player into a dogmatist and limit his flexibility and creativity. Today we are going to explore how creativity beyond traditional principles can elevate your game. We will examine a game played by a great theoretician, Isaac Boleslavsky. In this game, Boleslavsky voluntarily creates a backward pawn and a weak square in his position, thus violating a very important positional principle. However, in return he gets a tremendous counterplay and his monster bishops simply tear the enemy position apart. As a result, the Boleslavsky variation revolutionized chess theory and became a common line in the Sicilian defense. Boleslavsky's opponent starts with e4, Boleslavsky plays the Sicilian defense, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes d, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, d6, and in this position white has a couple of options. The most common one is bishop g5, the Rouser variation, or white can try bishop c4, which was Fischer's favorite, the Sozin attack. In our game, white opts for bishop e2 instead, which is also a common line. In this position, before Boleslavsky's revolutionary discovery, the common move for black was e6. In this case, the position would have transposed into the Scheveningen variation. In this case, black controls the important squares, however, his position would be cramped. As you see, black pieces are placed on the first 3 ranks, while white is placed on the 4 ranks. That means white has the space advantage. And black's light-squared bishop is bad, it's restricted by its own pawn, and usually after finishing the development by castling, developing the bishop, white starts a strong attack on the king side by playing f4. However, in our game, instead of e6, Boleslavsky plays e5, which would have horrified the classical chess school, of course, because this move, from the point of view of the traditional positional principles, is a terrible positional mistake, because by playing e5, black has created a backward pawn on d6 and has eternally weakened the d5 square. So the d6 pawn will turn into a target of attack. White's major pieces on the half-open d file will exert very strong pressure on this pawn, and the d5 square will be occupied by white pieces, and white will get a great outpost on this square. However, this kind of evaluation would have been too dogmatic, because it doesn't take into account the dynamism. From the dynamic point of view, a square or a pawn can be considered weakness only if this weakness can be exploited by the opponent. Otherwise, it's only formally weak, but actually it isn't weak. And as this game will show, white cannot effectively exploit the weakness of d5 and d6. While in his turn, by playing e5, black has taken under control very important squares on white's territory. That means white doesn't have a space advantage anymore, and black's position will not be as cramped as in case of e6 instead of e5, because now he also has vacated the e6 square for his bishop, so he will develop the bishop on e6 and will get a very good counterplay, which of course will compensate for the weakness of d5 and d6. So now white's knight is under attack. In case white exchanges the knights, that would be in black's favor, because after b takes c, black would regain the control over the d5 square. It won't be weak anymore, and black will also get the half-open b file. The common move after e5 is knight b3. But in our game, white retreated his knight to f3, which is also perfectly playable. Now a fierce battle for the weak d5 square begins. White would love to play bishop g5 next move, in order to pin the knight and exchange his bishop for this knight, because this knight is a key defender of the d5 square. For this reason, Boleslavsky prevents it by playing h6. White increases the control over this square, bishop c4. Now the bishop, together with the knight, controls this square. Boleslavsky develops his king's bishop, and now white cannot play knight d5. neither now nor next moves, because in case white he plays knight d5 right away, his e4 pawn would fall. The knight must keep an eye on e4. If white plays knight d5 right away, black would simply capture this pawn. That's why white reinforces this pawn. Queen e2. Boleslavsky castles, and white plays h3, taking under control the g4 square and preparing the attack on the king side by pushing the g-pawn forward. Boleslavsky plays bishop e6. Now the knight together with the bishop controls the weak d5 square. And in case white exchanges on e6, that again would be in black's favor, because after f takes e, again black regains the control over the square and opens the f file for his rook, and the rook will exert very unpleasant pressure on white's king side. In case white, instead of exchanging on e6, immediately occupies the square, again that would be in black's favor, because ideally white would love to have a piece on this square in order to get a strong outpost, of course, and also keep the d file half open so that his major pieces can put pressure on the backward d6 pawn. But in case white plays knight d5 right away, black would simply exchange, and after the mass exchanges, eventually white will be forced to capture on d5 with a pawn, after which black solves all his problems, because white's own pawn on d5 closes the d file for him, and white major pieces cannot put pressure on the backward pawn anymore, and neither can white occupy the d5 square with a piece, because his pawn occupies this square. Besides that, the white pawn has left the e4 square, moving to d5, and that means after moving away his knight from c6, black can start an attack on the king side by playing f5. He will have a pawn majority on the king side, 4 pawns against white's 3 pawns, and by pushing pawns forward, he can start a very strong attack on the white king. So for this reason, as immediate knight d5 doesn't work, white simply castles king side. And Boleslavsky makes a standard Sicilian move, rook c8, occupying the half-open file and creating an immediate threat. As you see, at the moment, the bishop is attacked only once, and black is threatening to play knight d4 with the discovered attack on the bishop, attacking it for the second time, and also attacking the queen. And that would be deadly. For this reason, to prevent knight d4, white retreats his bishop to b3. Boleslavsky continues the battle for the key d5 square. One of the main pieces for white, which controls this square, is the light squared bishop. So Boleslavsky wants to exchange this bishop. Knight a5. He is going to exchange his knight for this bishop. White prevents it. He plays rook d1, putting his rook on the same file with the black queen and threatening knight takes e5, after which black won't be able to recapture, as his queen would be lost. For this reason, black cannot capture on b3 right away, because after a takes b, 2 black pawns would fall under attack, the a7 pawn and the e5 pawn. For this reason, Boleslavsky postpones the capture on b3. Instead, he plays queen c7, moving away the queen from the d file and increasing the pressure on the c file. So what to do now? It isn't easy to find a plan for white. For example, in case white plays knight d5, which again looks like the most natural move, it doesn't work, because black would simply capture, and it turns out that in case white captures with the bishop actually on b3 is defending the c2 pawn, but if white captures, the c2 pawn would fall. Now the pressure on the c file would tell, and black would simply capture on c2 and would be up a pawn. So after in case white plays knight d5, after knight takes d5, white would be forced to capture with a pawn, and again the d file would close, black would solve all his problems and simply retreat his bishop, followed by f5, black is better. Probably the best move recommended by computer in this position, as knight d5 doesn't work, would be knight h2. So computer recommends knight h2 with the idea of knight g4. In order to exchange the f6 knight. So in order to exchange the g4 knight for the f6 knight, because this knight plays a very important role in the defense of this square, after which, after the exchange of these knights, black's control over d5 would decrease, but black in his turn would exchange the bishop, so the position would remain more or less equal. Instead of this, instead of knight h2, which wasn't an easy move to find, white plays g4, which was a dubious decision. So white is still thinking about the attack on the king side. However, it turns out that white doesn't have the sufficient amount of attacking resources on the king side. Besides that, black pieces are very active, and that means white's attack cannot be successful. So by playing g4, white just weakened his king side, and this weakness will tell, as you will see. Now Boleslavsky exchanges the valuable bishop, knight takes b3, a takes b, the a file is open and a7 pawn is under attack, so Boleslavsky plays a6. Not just to save the pawn, but also taking under control the b5 square and preparing the advance of the b pawn. He's going to push the pawn forward, kicking out the knight from c3, after which the c2 pawn would fall and black major pieces will invade the second rank. White still thinks about the attack. He plays king h1, vacating the g1 square for his rook. Most probably white didn't expect immediate b5, because in case black plays b5, the a6 pawn would fall. But Boleslavsky still plays b5. It turns out that in case white captures on a6, black would play b4, kicking out the knight, and after knight d5, black would exchange. Again, white cannot capture with the rook, of course, because the knight would capture. He would be forced to capture with a pawn. Again, black solves all his problems as the d-file is closed. Black would return a pawn and attacking the b3 pawn, so white would be forced to exchange the queens and black pieces would be much more active. The black rook would invade the second rank, the pawn would be under attack, after white defends it. The second rook would be brought into game with great effect, with a tempo. Black is threatening to capture on c1. If the bishop moves, the b2 pawn would fall. White can try rook c6, but again, after the exchange, black wins a pawn and with a better, more active position. So after b5, rook takes a6 doesn't work, and black is threatening to push the pawn forward. For this reason, white prevents it by playing b4 himself. However, on b3, the white pawn controlled the c4 square, and now that it has left the b3 square, the c4 square is unguarded and Boleslavsky immediately invades. Queen c4, forcing the exchange of the queens, because otherwise black queen would capture on b4. So white exchanges the queens, and after that white can forget about the attack on the black king, because without queens, of course, he doesn't have any chances to create any realistic threats to the black king. While the black rook has become very active, attacking the e4 pawn for the second time. That means black is threatening to capture it, and also attacking the b4 pawn. So black has completely seized the initiative. White must do something about this important central pawn, and the only move, it turns out that the only way to continue the resistance for white would have been knight d2. However, this move looks ugly, because on d2 the knight is closing the rook's file and the bishop's diagonal. However, this was the only way to continue, because the knight would have defended the pawn and attacked the rook. And after black captures on b4, white would in his turn capture on a6. Black would solve all his problems by getting rid of his backward pawn by pushing it forward, and after the mass exchanges on d5, black would get a slight advantage on account of a bishop pair and more active pieces. So white pieces are of course very passive, but white still could have continued the resistance. Black's advantage would be only slight. But it seems that white didn't want to make this ugly move, knight d2. Instead, he defends the e4 pawn in a more natural way, rook e1. And in case black captures on b4 now, white would capture on a6. But Boleslavsky isn't in a hurry to capture on b4. This pawn is doomed anyways, so he makes a much stronger move instead. A move that wasn't easy to spot. So he returns the bishop to its initial square, bishop c8, not just defending the pawn, but also preparing bishop b7, and from b7 the bishop will increase black's pressure on white's central e4 pawn. White tries to get some counterplay, so he pushes the g pawn forward. H takes g, bishop takes g5, and of course bishop b7, attacking the pawn for the third time. And the bishop not only attacks the pawn, it exerts a very unpleasant pressure on the long diagonal. So indirectly it is attacking the knight and the king. So white moves his king away from this diagonal, king h2. Of course, black cannot capture on e4 right away. That would be a mistake, because white, of course, would capture on e7. So Boleslavsky simply captures on b4, winning a pawn and attacking b2. White plays b3, and it turns out that the black rook is trapped. It might get in trouble, because all squares the rook can move to are controlled by white. However, the advance of the b pawn has a serious drawback. On b2, the pawn was defending the knight, and that means now that it has left the b2 square, the c-file is weak, and Boleslavsky brings his second rook into play with a tempo, attacking the knight. In case the knight moves, the c2 pawn would fall. That's why white defends the knight with a rook, rook e3. And now that the rook is on e3, it turns out that black can play rook d4, right under attack of the knight. But white cannot capture the rook, because after e takes d, the pawn would fork the knight and the rook. For this reason, after rook d4, white plays rook g1, creating some unpleasant x-ray on the g-file, so Boleslavsky simply moves his king away from the g-file, defending the bishop. And this knight is very strong. It is attacking the e4 pawn and controls the important d5 square, while the white bishop isn't really doing much. So white decided to exchange his bishop for the knight. Bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6. Now black bishop actually is a bad piece, as it's restricted by its own pawns on the dark squares. However, black is still threatening to push the b pawn forward, kicking out the knight, because the knight is defending the e4 pawn, and after the knight retreats, the e4 pawn will fall. For this reason, white plays rook g4, defending the e4 pawn. Black still plays b4, kicking out the knight from the active position. And in case the knight moves to d5, which looks like the most natural move, black would simply exchange on d5. Now his rook would be under attack, but first he would exchange the rooks. After that, he would capture on c2 and would get absolutely winning position. For this reason, instead of knight d5, white plays knight a4 to the edge of the board. However, now that the knight has left the c3 square, white is threatening to capture the rook, because after e takes d, the d4 pawn, the pawn will move to d4, but it wouldn't fork the knight and the rook anymore. That means the threat is real. White is threatening to capture the rook. What to do? Now you can pause the video and try to find Boleslavsky's idea. So, of course, black could have just moved his rook away from d4 by playing rook d1. In this case, black still would be much better, but white could have solved some of his problems in this case. For example, the problem of the backward pawn, which is the target of attack, and the problem of the knight, which is badly placed on the edge of the board. So white could have played c4, black most probably would capture en passant, and white knight would return into the game by capturing the pawn. Black would be up a pawn, black's position would be winning, of course, but white might prolong the resistance in this case. Instead, Boleslavsky decided to play for the attack. He's going to checkmate the white king. So he sacrifices the rook, sacrifices the exchange, in order to activate all of his remaining pieces. At the moment, as you see, the dark squared bishop is bad bishop. It's restricted by its own pawn. So Boleslavsky captures on c2. Now his rook dominates the second rank, White must, of course, accept the sacrifice. Knight takes d4, and after e takes d, the dark squared bishop also becomes a very strong piece, so it gets a great square on e5, and the d pawn turns into a passed pawn, so it will move forward. Besides that, everything is under attack. The rook is under attack, the f2 pawn is under attack, and e4 pawn is under attack. So the black is threatening simply to capture on f2 with a check, getting a second pawn for the exchange. The only way to save the pawn, as the rook is also under attack, would be rook f3, but it doesn't work. In this case, black would have played bishop e5 check, and after king g1, rook e2, attacking the e4 pawn for the second time, and there is no defense. Besides that, black is threatening rook e1 check, and after king g2, bishop takes e4, and the rook would be pinned. In order to prevent this, white can try king f1, but after rook takes e4, black would get a second pawn for the exchange, and also the rook on f3 is still a target of attack. For example, if white exchanges after bishop takes e4, it turns out that the rook is trapped, it doesn't have a single square to move. For this reason, as rook f3 doesn't work, white retreats his rook to e1. But now, of course, rook takes f2 check follows. Rook g2, of course, black could have exchanged rooks, after which he still would be much better, but Boleslavsky is playing for the attack. He is going to weave a mating net around the white king. So he needs his rook, he needs to retain the rook for the attack. Now his bishops with the rook will create terrible threats to the white king. So rook f3. The b3 pawn also falls under attack, but Boleslavsky isn't really thinking about this pawn. He's thinking about the king. Rook c2. White tries to create some counterplay, occupying the open file and threatening to invade the c7 square. d3, pushing the pawn forward, attacking the rook. Rook c7, attacking the bishop. Bishop e5 check, king g1, d2, attacking the rook. Rook d1, bishop d4 check, king h2, rook f2 check, king g3, bishop takes e4. Now the bishops simply turn into monsters. Rook c4, attacking the bishop cannot retreat because the second bishop would fall, but Boleslavsky plays rook f3 check, king h2, bishop e5 check, moving away the bishop from e5 with a tempo. After king moves to g1, now d5, defending the bishop with a tempo, attacking the rook. Rook c8 check, king e7, now white eliminates the dangerous pawn, rook takes d2, bishop f4. Boleslavsky still doesn't care about the pawn, he brings his bishop closer to the white king. Bishop f4 with a tempo, attacking the rook, followed by bishop e3 check next move. So he's weaving a mating net around the white king. Rook b2, white defends the pawn, but black wasn't going to take it anyways. Bishop e3 check, king h2, rook f1, threatening checkmate in 1. To prevent this, white plays king g3, rook g1 check. The bishops coordinate very well and they control all the squares on the f file, so the white king must move to the h file, to the edge of the board. In case it moves to h4, the king would be checkmated in 2 moves, after bishop g5 check, followed by g6 checkmate. That's why the king moves to h2. Now, of course, black cannot play bishop f4 check because the king would capture the rook. That's why Boleslavsky moves his rook to g6. The rook is still cutting the king on the g file and vacates the g1 square for the bishop. Black is threatening 2 checkmates, bishop g1 checkmate and bishop f4 checkmate. And it turns out that there is no defense. In case white plays h4, vacating the h3 square for the king would still get checkmated after bishop g1 check and bishop f5 checkmate. For this reason, after rook g6, white resigned. And now I recommend watching how David Bronstein completely ignores the traditional principles and creates an attacking masterpiece. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.